Hallo, schönen guten Morgen.
Hey, good morning. It's great to have you here. Nils already introduced us so well. We can go right into the conversation and maybe try to leave some room at the end for your questions and comments. But first, I would like to know, Hedwig, how did this term even get established? I think before the war, maybe being a housewife was a luxury, a privilege for rich people. But did we have something like this already in the 20s as a societal concept? Yes, definitely. It's pretty interesting that already at the end of the 19th century, this is being discussed a lot. And interestingly, the Social Democratic Party, the first one to support women's voting rights, their members, many members said we also want to have a right for like being a housewife. And they saw it was a privilege, how hard their housewives, their wives work, because the alternative where both have to work is just a lot of work. It's very clear that the housework, the chores are done by the woman, by the wife. And looking through most of history, it's always women's work. And then Sunday, the one free day in the work, she has to use that if she otherwise works during the week. So it's a super hard life. It's even harder than the life of a worker. And that's where this idea comes from, that we want to have the right to be a housewife. They didn't think it's good that women also work, and we need to make it possible, make it equal. And of course, it's also female workers like Clara Zetkin that very soon said, well, the solution can't be to keep women out of the working space. Okay, so to recap, equal rights for housewives. So it's not just a rich privilege for rich people with maids, but also that workers' wives will also have this privilege in the future. And this was kind of what the Social Democrats demanded back then. Yeah, that was one of many demands that they made. It wasn't like prominent in the program, but it was a strong position. The Social Democratic Party was very male. It was a very male culture that made it hard for women, even though they had a lot of great and prominent women. But it's very important. We should keep that in the back of your mind if we're thinking about this discussion, why Western societies after the Second World War even had this weird idea to reinstall this concept of housewives. Okay, I think that's super interesting. There's a bit of an idea already what you might respond to my next question. So my next assumption would be, okay, during the war, women had a very tough time. They were used as birthing machines. They had to raise children by themselves when the men were at war. Then they rebuilt. They had a lot of responsibility, a lot of different kinds of responsibilities for women, but also a lot of autonomy, especially in the early post-war society. And so I asked myself, when did this switch happen? How did they interest women in this concept of being a housewife again, after they've experienced so much, like maybe not liberties in terms of how we think about it today, but just in terms of societal responsibility. So I asked myself a bit, okay, what was the promise? You had a really bad time, now it's time to lean back? Or like what was the promise here? Yeah, that's really important. It didn't just suddenly reappear after the war, but it took a few years, you can say maybe until the currency reforms, where things just went any which way, also in a positive way, as many women thought. For example, it was discussed, don't we actually need concepts of three people in a relationship? Don't we need thruples? So different media have been discussing that seriously because there were so few men. So there were many more women than men, because many men died in the war or were in captivity. So a woman writes a letter to a newspaper. They say, okay, but this should be useful for me. It's not about men having more fun. There were a lot of children out of wedlock. a lot of widows, and the divorce rate goes up like crazy. So women are very self-confident. They have a lot of options what they can do, and it's not really clear anymore what their life needs to look like. So then what happened? It's interesting that this concept comes back. The important thing about history is that we see that things aren't the way they are, but that it's something that's not something natural, but something that people do, which also means we can change things again. So how did people get that idea that being a housewife is something natural, it's a natural order, it's something desirable? And when we think about gender roles, we have that very often, that people sell something as the natural thing, the right thing, the normal thing that we're striving to. And what's important there is that it wasn't even a German phenomenon. It's something that we saw in all Western societies. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the most important ones is this desire for an order after years of chaos, not just in Germany, but of course also in the occupied countries. Even the US were very strongly affected by the war. They had shortages. And this idea that there is one natural model, an idyllic model, where the housewife is something in a part of nature that's always been there, that doesn't have a history, that has a long history. So this desire for this model has become very strong. I always thought it was a bit of a American export, the Fordian family model, where you propagated the man has to work, the woman has to stay at home, there's a single income household, and that's the ideal type of family. Yeah, I think that's important. The rate of working women at the end of the 19th century in Germany was higher than in other countries. So it wasn't a German tradition that came back. The US were an important example. And societies developed a stronger awareness that they live in a democracy. It didn't really matter before. It was also, there was a big struggle about it. Of course, the Nazis deliberately destroyed that feeling. And it's so wild that this unequal model of gender roles was used to rebuild democracy. What kind of narratives were used there? One of the most important sociologists of the German post-war society, formerly close to Nazi thinking philosopher, then wrote about having a equalized middle-class society, and that would be the goal of democracy. We have an egalitarian society. The housewife model is paradoxically very important, because now everybody has a housewife. Also the worker, and the housewife cleans her own living space, but also like workers definitely, but also, for example, the housewife was of a banker would also clean up the home. So something that maybe today we would see as a bit perverted, that losing the maid privilege, that now everybody has to clean their own home, and that's sort of equality. Yeah, exactly. So obviously it wasn't right. Lots of working women still had to work their jobs and also do the housework. And of course there were still maids, but this model, this norm was there, and it's very important that there was this connection as well with heteronormativity, with sexuality. Gay people are still
Wir sehen immer die Bilder von KZs und wow, wie toll, jetzt endlich hört es auf. Schwule kommen dann ins Zuchthaus und dieser von den Nationalsozialisten verschärfte Paragraph, den
and they are incarcerated. And this idea that gays are destructive is something that's just perpetuated in the New Republic. The gender roles that is being perceived as natural, that includes that any deviation is unnatural and problematic. And of course, lots of values from National Socialism were just continued instead of accepting the more liberal society that from the 20s before fascism. Yeah, it's not that people kind of say wink, wink, nudge, nudge, what we did with the Nazis was the right thing. but instead they want to create models that want to distance themselves and separate themselves from National Socialism. So the family model was strengthened in a way opposing National Socialism that kind of reached into the families with the Hitlerjugend and also with the family, like everybody watching each other, reporting themselves to the authorities. So the family was always ranked under the party. Housewives should not just be at home and hearth, but also they should be politically active. They were involved, the mother's education, where we have the Nazi propaganda. And this new housewife-focused family is used to say the Nazis, that was bad. They tried to affect how you do your family life. The party was overreaching. And in this way, politics by itself are also being made out of something problematic, especially when it regards women. And now in the Federal Republic of Germany, we have a new model where the family is protected from this problematic politics, from the state overreach. All right, and still there is a certain coupling between different terms or cultural phenomena, especially in West Germany. Maybe you can talk a bit about the connection between the cult of the mother and the concept of housewives. Yeah, I think it's a bit of a problem in German history research. If we look at phenomena that are international, or in this case, like Western societies, if you look at Europe and North America, that we try to find national explanations for that. And normally they don't go far enough. The cult of motherhood is an important concept of the 19th century for the bourgeois society. And it's often, it seems that this is made out to be a German phenomenon when we read about it. This idea that woman is the other, the other that bears the children. This is often accompanied by putting women on a pedestal. Women are different. They shouldn't have to go into politics. The discrimination always goes along with a certain, like painting the woman as a mother, as something holy and better. And of course, this is the Nazis do take that up as a natural, and then taken over as a natural concept into this housewife idea instead of the way the Nazis started. So one reason why it was so strong is the Western concept. You could also call it the capitalist concept, because housewives were the professionals of this new consumer era. So you can say they were kind of dedicated full-time, not just to do all the chores at home. And before we had kitchen machines and all the household gadgets, that was a really, really, really hard job. And then they can focus more and more on consumption because they have to do less manual labor. So this connection between housewifism and democracies and consumption is very obvious and very important. In the US, it's quite explicit. If you want to be if you're a good Democrat, then you are a good housewife. If you're a good housewife, you are democratic. And then you make good democratic decisions, like I buy made in the USA products, I buy national products. So in the US, you can see even more strongly how that's been connected. But of course, the same thing we see in France or Germany, that women become the specialists for consumption and always getting indoctrinated deeper and deeper. They have to dive deeper into these worlds of consumption more and more. And again, now in the Trump playbook that we maybe get back to in a minute, is that also part of the reason why this patriarchal idea of the family, this model, the strong relationship to capitalist ideas of consumption, and the fact that it's not just a national phenomenon, but a cultural phenomenon in the Western sphere? Yeah, certainly. The question why the patriarchy, it's like a very coarse term, but I think we can use it here, why it's why it survives so well, why it holds up so long, why it's so tough. It's one of the most interesting questions in history, I think. I don't have a good answer. It's just think that it's always being marked as the natural order of things. this model always comes up after like revolutions, after wars, and that's when it gets reconfirmed. When people want to go back to sort of order, it's a model where people feel that this is something that's like calm and ordered and not chaotic. So this, I think, is an important concept. This connection between capitalism, consumption, gender roles, and it wasn't like men took part in household chores, but this order is so tough that it's also in very different systems of society. It's still very, very strong and prominent. So that's why I think it's very important that we focus our research on that as well. It's very important to explain that. But in post-war times, there were also strong anti-capitalist voices, and they weren't only left, they were also often on the conservative side, maybe even stronger there, because for social democrats it was clear that in a social economy, and definitely not a dictatorial socialism as we've seen in the GDR, that's how we built this new order. So there was a strong suspicion of consumption, there was a strong anti-Americanism, there was also like great friendship with the Americas, with the Allied forces, but there were also a lot of voices against that. And the housewives that said, oh, that inherited this idyllic idea that were conservatives, and the whole society wanted to accept this new model. And what we see much more these days than in the past, this destructive model also. The history of housewives in the early German Republic is the history of great acceleration. So where consumption has exploded, where many say this is the beginning of the Anthropocene, this is the begin of where the CO2 levels like rose very quickly, the hockey stick curves. When we started CO2, like the CO2 levels started rising already before, but in the 50s they really, really go up crazy. We create plastic, we create paper for fast food, for all kinds of consumer goods, but also the acidification of the ocean. So that's the time of the great acceleration. And the idea, or one of my theses, is that this is legitimized also through housewifism. That somewhat like problematic people, problematic men, consume as crazy. That would not have been received as well as when the housewife does it. So in the US, it's also important that she's acting economically, that she's saving money, she's diligent, and so capitalism with all of its destructive aspects was accepted, and this way it could also be legitimized.
All right, so let's skip to now. So what we can see today in politics, like how can we break up certain structures? Because lots and lots of what we've talked about still sticks around until this day, right? 67% of all women work part-time, but like a single-digit number of fathers. And so should more mothers work full-time? Yeah, of course, that's quite reasonable. It's out of the question that everyone should like freely decide and choose for themselves, right? In different times, there's always been this case where women had to make their own decisions against the majority of the society. And so, for example, women who stay at home today, it's delegitimized, right? So no matter what women do, they always have the feeling of being wrong. And so it's important that everyone gets to do what they think is right. But of course, when it's society and society's great structures, expectations, norms, and so it's important, I think, that we live in a society where we wish for women to work full-time, but also to have these structures. And of course, the most important thing is childcare, which is very lacking. And that's very, very problematic and keeps women from working full-time. And I want to shout out to Theresa Bücker, a German author, and this idea how important it is to work full-time, and who draws that into question, and like, what do we think of as full-time? And maybe we can see how great it is to actually raise children and spend time with them, and how great it is for mothers, not just mothers, but also for aunts, for fathers. And so to reconceptualize our idea of how do we spend our time, what do we have to do. Of course, we need work, we need full-time work, but, is the model of our chancellor right, who says that the German people have to work more? I think that's very problematic statistics, as we know, because part-time workers are treated as full-time workers. Yes, very important point. Thank you for pointing that out. So we live through quite a lot of polarization in our society, and part of that is online in how certain women role models are shaped. So on the one hand, we have like queer, feminist spoke people on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have tradwives, right? And so in the digital realm, we see these different models of housewives which have been catapulted into modern times and try to draw us into one direction. So do you follow that, like how housewives are being perceived and this gender order that we have right now online? Yeah, of course, and I think you're quite the expert for that. Yeah, well, as a hobby, I watch how Mormons live because it's so far removed from my own life. Sometimes I watch tradwives on Instagram or TikTok, and I think it's quite interesting to see how the so-called DIY culture of like doing everything yourself for your family is politically instrumentalized for right-wing politics. And of course, these accounts aren't presenting as political, but they are like close to Trump and they have a political agenda. And so, again, women and the role of women, is being presented in different ways and in this conservative tradwife corner. Yes, and I think that confirms another thesis I have for this phenomenon in the post-war years in Germany, because I think the German people knew that something went really, really wrong. So it's not just like, we're just going to continue with that. Everything was broken. Like it wasn't like after World War I where you could just supposedly be the victim. And of course, the German people were forced to go to concentration camps and to watch those horrific images of those mass crimes. And how did that happen? And there was this opening up in families where this was called into question. And so how can societies make it through times of crisis? And I've said already that after times of revolution, of crisis, we have this reinstantiation of the old patriarchal order. And I think one reason for that is that in patriarchal societies, you have to have peaceful times for the men. And after 45, how do you treat those young German men? How do you tell them to stop fighting? How do you make them be peaceful? How do you have them as a regular part of society? And lots of people were very critical of that and thought that might not work out. And so one thesis is that this model of patriarchy sort of was an opening for these young, aggressive men, and also religion, that it sort of drew them in. We have this resurgence of religion, which didn't, play a large role in National Socialism. And so men were sort of lulled in, and as the boss in the family. So maybe he definitely lost on the battlefield, right? He was a loser when it came to the war. And of course, maybe he even lost a limb, for example. But then he came back home and he could be the boss again. And so with the tradwife phenomenon, I think as well, we can see that after times of crisis, of transformation, we see that men might need this sort of protective realm around them of this housewife idyllic conception. Yeah, so rhetorically asking, what can we ask from that? But also maybe from a feminist emancipatory standpoint, with all the young men, who choose to vote for the right-wing extremist AfD in this country, what do we do with them? So we're out of time. Maybe we can have one or two questions from the audience. Up front. You're going to get a mic. Yeah, I often hear that on social media, on TikTok, for example, that people have a problem with the fact that people don't own anything these days, right? You don't have DVDs, you just stream. Everything important is in the cloud. Does that relate to tradwives? Like, maybe, as a man, maybe you can actually own your wife as a sort of a physical object? That's really interesting, because like how a tradwives in the videos, right? How they touch the eggs from the chickens. So that's a famous tradwife influencer, and it's very physical. Yeah, I saw a video like that this morning, and I think that's quite an interesting point. In the 50s, the revival of the 50s, right? That's not true, really, because in the 50s, you had like you had like the beginning of ready-made food and canned food, and so it wasn't that fresh, right? And so they didn't like bake their own bread. And so, but that would really, support this thesis of having something to own and dealing with that and your ownership. Yeah, and in the back row. Yeah, I think online we can find for quite some time that we're sort of being prepared for this housewife thing, right? Because earlier, like women were caught up in the kitchen. And today we're caught up in children's birthday parties and vegan cooking, stuff like that. And that takes time away from political participation. And I think that's really built up online in the last few years. Yeah, that's an interesting aspect. I feel like maybe the tradwife phenomenon actually makes us all feel better, right? Because we can look at them and be like, well, look at her, she's baking cakes all day. But of course, like most women are housewives. If you're single, you're a housewife. If you live in a heterosexual partnership, after a short time, most chores are being done by the woman. And so, maybe we should stop and ask ourselves critically, and men especially, what separates the tradwife online from the regular model of our society that almost all of us live in and that we're caught in? Yeah, it's a good question and a call to action that we can take with us. Thank you, Hedwig, for being here with us. Please, big hand for Hedwig. Thank you.